We are very lucky to have another surprise guest with us, a former ambassador to India, Ambassador David Mulford. And Ambassador has been, most people don't understand the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement because I got a lot of my arm twisted by the ambassador every time I would visit him in India. He played a significant role, even though he's going to be hesitant to admit that, in pushing that relationship along. He worked not just the American side, but he worked very, very hard, and which the Indian side was probably a lot harder than the American side, because in our meetings he would be talking about this. He has had a real distinguished career. I could go on and on. He's the vice chair right now at Credit Suisse, but still stays engaged in India. As he was mentioning to us before, he goes twice to India and just has a lot of passion. Ambassador Mulford, if you can share some remarks, please.
I don't need a piece of paper to talk about India, but I'm going to make some comments of a rather specific nature a little later on. First of all, let me just make a simple point to all people who live in democracies. Elections have consequences. We all know that. And India is no exception at all to that proposition. I don't want to spend time here reviewing the election because I think everybody knows how dramatic, what a watershed it was, what an accomplishment, and so on and so forth. And I think I recognize that. I'm very excited about it myself. I think it is an absolutely fantastic mandate that this government will have. But of course, the question is always, how do mandates get used? And how complicated really is it to deploy a mandate of this magnitude in a country as diverse, with as many different opinions, because not everybody wants to be Gujarat in India. So, I mean, one has to face up to these realities, and the Constitution gives many powers to the states as opposed to the federal government. So when you get around to actually doing things, I think we all know it is and can be rather complex. What I would say about the past, I was ambassador in India for 5 years and 2 months. I worked on the civil nuclear deal for 4 years. It was something we had to never give up on. I think it's one of the most important things that's been done anywhere in the world. I agree with the view in India at the time that it was the most important diplomatic initiative of the last 50 years. But it has not come fully to life yet for reasons that have to do with politics in India. Let's hope that can be fixed. But India needs a nuclear industry because it must grow. It must diversify its energy base. And when it gets to the economic high table, it does not want to be the world's leading polluter. And so that is why this area has to be addressed, because in my view, it's a $100 to $150 billion industry still waiting to be birthed. One of the most significant developments when I was ambassador was what I call the very beginning of the rural transformation in India's economy. This really began to be visible in about 2007, 2008, and I was very excited about it because it came on top of the mobile telecom revolution, coverage of India, but with a lot of other developments, including handouts, make-work programs, subsidies, and so on, given by the Congress government, which had the effect of placing the first slice of significant disposable income in the pockets of many, many Indians in rural India. They began to be consumers and to take part in the modern economy. Today, I was there in November leading a group of investors to India, and we sit down, spend about 5 days. We see 7 or 8 companies a day who come and present to us. And for the first time, every private sector company that we interviewed in India started their presentation by saying, our top priority is rural India. That's where the growth is. At 4.5%, there's a lot of disappointment, but on a relative basis, the rural economy is growing faster on a relative basis than vis-a-vis the urban economy and middle-class economy than it was in the past. And this is a real revolution, because if the private sector turns to rural India Imagine the investment that is going to, and is already taking place. One of the banks we interviewed had opened 1,400 new branches in the last 12 months. Suzuki is opening showrooms and repair centers in small towns and villages. Gujarat is focusing on consumer products usable by villagers and in small communities, and so on. So I wanted to point out that reform and progress in India is a long-term proposition. Since 1991, all governments have wanted to make reforms and open India, but they've all had difficulty. Reform has been uneven, very difficult politically, and it's taken a number of years to reach the point where in 2003 we had breakout growth, and it took place in the whole of the 5-year period I was there. When I served as ambassador, being a private sector person, my view of that ambassadorship was, yes, I was in charge of the diplomatic bilateral relationship between our two countries, but the real relationship of power is between our civil societies and our private sectors. That is where the engagement has always taken place. And I recall we processed something like 800,000 visas a year while I was there. And we no longer made people wait 187 days for an appointment, by the way. It got it down to 6 days all over India. So with those introductory remarks, I was asked by my friend here, be specific. You know, you're an ambassador, you're a banker, you're a former Treasury official, and it's not like me not to be specific. Now, what I don't want to be is prescriptive, so please forgive me. I'm not telling India what to do, but I am going to outline some of the things that I think are essential to address. Politics is difficult, and all of these things will be difficult to do, but if you want a program, these are the things you have to address, and I'm sure business people in this crowd will agree. First of all, Gujarat has the best growth record in India, has been stated, and also the best record of attracting foreign direct capital. The message there of the last few years, when momentum has been lost in India, in growth momentum, is that FDI has to be opened up again. That has to be a conscious policy, and there's a number of steps that have to be made. First of all, legacy issues have to be settled now. That is to say, things like removing the retroactive nature of tax policy to reach back into the past. If you do that, companies won't come. And if you can reach all the way back to 1962, you can imagine how insecure it makes people feel. Stop micromanaging joint venture investments. Article 18. That is not required. The government doesn't need to be in the middle of joint venture disputes. They can be settled by negotiation or by going to the Indian courts. And the government should, in my view, withdraw from this and make joint venture operations much more flexible. It is going to be necessary to take fiscal action because the fiscal situation in India needs attention, inflation needs attention, and so there has to be fiscal action. This will make voters unhappy, some voters. And I would advise that it be done in the first 100 days if you've got 5 years to serve, because get it out of the way and take advantage of the results later. The reason for this is that the voting public of India, remarkably, in my view, demonstrated on voting day that they understood that the economy had slowed down, job creation was slowing, inflation was rising, because you can't make growth with subsidies and government transfers and a 100 days of work program, etc. It comes from dynamic growth of the economy, and people understood that it wasn't good enough to do what had been done in the last 5 or 7 years, that there had to be a turn to a more rational growth policy. India needs to capitalize on that voter transformation, which was so importantly recorded in this comprehensive result. Addressing inflation. This is in part an infrastructure problem. Food inflation is a function of the fact that too many crops are left uncollected in the field, unwashed, undistributed, untransported to the cities, and placed in the hands of city consumers at reduced prices. So that's a You know, when you think of the crops mounting, as I saw them in the field in June, 2 weeks before the monsoon, and the wheat still not collected, you can understand what would happen if that 30% of crops was mobilized and reached the cities, and what that would do to prices. Don't cut interest rates to make growth short term. You're going to have to keep interest rates steady, maybe even a little up, to defeat inflation. Another area of great importance, difficult politically, I realize, is to address the question of state banks. State banks need more equity in India to support development. India's problem isn't savings. It has one of the highest savings rates in the world. Its problem is the mobilization of savings. State banks are managed by people who don't stay very long. Continuity of management hasn't been there, and the equity portion of their balance sheet is insufficient. This obviously means you've got to sell some of those down, and I know that's a difficult decision, but in order to meet the demand that is rising in rural India, these banks are going to have to be able to branch and expand and out into rural India more quickly and deploy their capital. They need to let a corporate bond market develop, an active corporate bond market. And at the moment, the state banks in India are the financiers, the captive financiers of the fiscal deficit. Corruption has to be faced, and I think the sooner the better. And I know that's one of the things that generated concern in this election by all Indians, because Indians are tired of that tax as it is imposed on their economy. And this issue should be addressed certainly at high levels for large-scale transactions and so on. It's hard to sort of weed it out over time all the way down into society, but certainly first steps need to be taken. India needs to revise the mistaken civil nuclear legislation that was passed after we finished the civil nuclear deal, for the simple reason that the main nuclear players in the world do not feel adequately protected from civil nuclear liability under the new legislation, and so they won't come and invest in India. The parks are set aside, 2 for America, 1 for Russia, 1 for France, but GE, the Japanese, Siemens, the French are all still waiting to come. And that legislation can now be, one hopes, politically addressed and corrected. India must promote further rural transformation, as indeed I think it will, because this slice of disposable income, which doesn't seem large to you maybe, but multiplied by 700 or 800 million, is a major macro force in the development of India's economy. I believe that India should develop its navy. It should get into the shipbuilding business. And the United States, which has a close working relationship with the Indian Navy, should be crafting with India a strategic presence in the Indian Ocean. The United States is no longer going to be the biggest customer of Saudi Arabia, but we are still going to be the provider of security in the Indian Ocean and the Straits of Hormuz. We need India to help us, and India needs to be there because China should be operating further east, in my view. But it's not going to be if it's just a vacuum area. So my advice, get busy, get into the shipping building business a little more aggressively, and extend that operational hand to us. And also, and this is just to wind up, there's healthcare, there's education, there's water policy. All these things, without going into detail, need to be addressed. I am optimistic that with a majority like this and a single party and a muscular chief executive officer in the prime minister's seat in India, these things will begin to happen. I have enormous confidence in that. And I believe that India, its continuing rise, because it's already accomplished major things, its continuing rise will be one, if not the most important event of the next 50 years, and I include China in that comparison. Finally, one other word. The United States of America, my country, needs to find a way to recreate the dynamism of the 5 years that I was in India, when growth ranged between 7 and a little over 10% for 5 straight years, and millions, tens of millions of Indians were lifted from poverty. And your young and aggressive and aspirational population was getting education, was seeking jobs confidently. This process has slowed, and you cannot afford it, and we can't afford it. So we must come alive. The United States has allowed the Indian relationship to weaken, to lose its punch. And this is something that really desperately, in my view, needs to be repaired. And as a part of that, I think, certainly I would like to apologize, whether the administration does or not is another thing, for the way in which your Deputy General Counsel was treated quite unnecessarily, with the overreaction that went on in the United States and rightly offended many Indians. There was no excuse for the way that was handled, in my view, and we should just say so and apologize. So those are my remarks. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to see you all again. And I am back in India twice a year. My wife, Jeannie, you may remember, she started the Walk for Life in Delhi, the Cancer Walk. In 2008, she's been back every year to lead that walk. Now we're doing it in Rajpath. Imagine that, on a Sunday morning. And last year, February, we had 12,000 people, many young people. So that'll go on. Thanks for the privilege of being here today.
Very prescriptive. We are videotaping it, and we'll make sure it gets back to the right people there. Thanks so much, Ambassador. Thank you.